So while we all get mic'd up, I'll go down the line and introduce for you. Derek Chalet here just came up on stage with the crutches. He just recently, or I guess more than a year ago now, left the Obama administration, had been at the Pentagon. We've traveled some miles around the world together. He's now at the German Marshall Fund and recently wrote the book, The Long Game, which is about Obama defying expectations. He's going to explain some of that. Bob Kagan here, who you all very well know from Brookings, is right next to me. Carol, you just heard lay out all this information. He's going to help us sort of make sense of what this means to give us some perspective. And Laura Mendeville is from Le Figaro. She has been covering here in the U.S. the Obama administration since its inception. She's the U.S. bureau chief for that paper. And she's going to give us a little bit of the view of what the rest of the world thinks about America, so we can all keep that perspective. So to all of you, I mean, we just saw what is assumed to be a degree of change in terms of America's place in the world. And I actually want to start with you, Laura, because this is something I constantly hear when I travel the world, from whether I'm in Europe, whether I'm in the Middle East, is that something has fundamentally changed, whether it's how America interacts with the rest of the world or that America doesn't want to have the role it once held. What is the perception of the U.S. right now?
Well, I guess there has been, of course, a big change since Obama came to power. And but I would, it's interesting. I mean, if we take, for instance, Europe, I think if you take different countries in the world, probably things would be different. But if we take Europe for a start, when Obama comes to power, there is this view in Western Europe, and especially I would say in France, that the US has been overreaching in terms of overusing its power abroad. And there is this famous expression by the former Minister of Foreign Affairs, Hubert Védrine, of the hyperpower, l'hyperpuissance, which was that America had gone too far, that there was this vertigo of success and of the unilateral, the single superpower trying to shape the world the way they wanted and exporting values, democracy, and going too far. I mean, trying to eat too much or do too much.
Which you said during the Clinton administration.
Yeah, I was going to say, that was the 1990s.
Yes.
When you said that.
You're absolutely right. It starts in the 1990s, after 1991. But I think the big moment when there is this idea that it's going too far comes with Iraq. And the Obama comes at this period, and in Europe is absolutely entranced. They are under the spell of Obama. They think he's going to be the best friend of Europe, and they are very excited. And actually, Obama disappoints Europe, I would say, pretty much from the start, because he starts his presidency from a trip to Europe, but it is perceived as not the most important thing, nevertheless, that he sort of pays the due and then moves to other things. And there's this famous, concept of pivoting to Asia, which is going to traumatize the Europeans. And Bob would say, what do you want, you Europeans? When we are very present, you think we are too present. And when we withdraw, you're complaining, so you're never happy, right? Like in a marriage. And and there is some truth to that. It's when I arrived here, it was very fascinating that a few months after Obama came in, the Europeans started complaining that he was not paying it enough attention, that he was not sufficiently, aware of what was going on, and so it was very interesting. What I would say, from my own point of view, when I arrived in this town, is that when I arrived in December 2008, I was actually covering for 20 years the post-communist world and Russia, and I had just come from the front in Georgia. So for me, what was going on in Europe was pretty tough. And I knew, because I had followed Russia for many years, that Russia had entered a very aggressive kind of revisionist period, and that we would hear from Russia a lot. And I was very struck when I arrived here that, Russia had disappeared as a threat. It was a time of reset. of the sort of great expectations of kind of friendship with the with the Russians. And at the same time, there was a total underestimation, I would say, ignorance of the Islamic issue here. It was not seen at all as a problem, and had also been covering Islam in Europe since 2001. You could see that the question of identity and in Islam in Europe was a rising question, extremely important, and the Americans didn't want to see it for different reasons that we can explore later on if you want. But this was the sort of context at the beginning of what we saw of Obama. And so there is this kind of situation goes on, you know, some frustrations, and Obama at the same time saying actually things that Donald Trump is saying now, you know, sort of telling the Europeans, take your part of the burden, you're not doing enough in defense, etc. And then comes August 2013, which is this, I think, a very important turning point, when the French, for instance, are ready to do something in Syria. They are ready to go, and they're nearly in the planes, the French pilots, and Obama decides that there's not going to be any kind of intervention after the red line had been, broken by Assad. And at this point, I think there is really a very important moment for understanding the American. Something is happening in America that it's not going to be the same America now.
And do you see that as a turning point? I mean, you hear America, when you travel the world, defined in either the post-World War II sense or the post-Cold War sense. Is there a post-Red Line America? I mean, is it that moment that Laura just described in terms of changing U.S. view of the world?
Well, I think that moment sort of epitomized and sort of crystallized what had already been occurring. I mean, clearly the United States has been in the experience of Iraq and Afghanistan and the financial crisis. I think it's not surprising that the United States decided that, or many Americans decided that they were, dealing with the rest of the world was not their problem right now. A great degree of feeling that American power was not effective in the world, et cetera. We had this sort of, books about the post-American world. So I think that the decision in the summer of 2013 was sort of the symbol of what had already been occurring. I mean, what I think we see in these polls, and what we've seen for quite some time, is a real questioning of a long period of relatively bipartisan consensus on America's role in the world that began at the end of World War II. And, I think it had sort of been on strategic fumes after the Cold War, but a series of presidents had nevertheless kept the United States in that role. But I don't think it's surprising that Americans are having real questions about that role. It's a huge burden, it's a moral burden, it's a physical burden, it's an economic burden, and that's what's happening now. And the only thing I would say is, the other thing you can tell from these polls, which you can see all through American history, Americans tend to follow what their party leaders are suggesting is correct, and B, Americans, a lot of what Americans feel bubbles up to the top, but they also sort of respond to and take direction from what the president and their political leaders are saying. This president has been saying, since he came into office, that we have got to turn from nation building abroad to nation building at home. That has found a receptive chord. Trump has played into that. And so I think, it's not only what the American people have done, but what their political leaders have decided to do that has set the tone. The only person who has been out there sort of the only person who currently has been a plausible candidate representing this bipartisan consensus is Clinton. And I think in her own party, it's a weakness. So let me just end by saying, if you look at the broad sweep of American history, beginning at least in the late 19th century, American sort of attitude towards engagement and involvement in the world has gone up and down in a kind of sine wave. Periods of extensive engagement have generally been followed by periods of disillusionment, a sense that it's too expensive, and a desire, a sort of movement toward retrenchment. And you can see this, I won't bore you with it, but you could see it going up and down all the way through this period. We're clearly in one of those trenches now, a sort of low part of the sine wave. And for me, probably the only question is, how long and deep is that trench before it starts to go back up again? Well, during the Cold War, they were brief and shallow. After Vietnam, 5 years later, it's Ronald Reagan, let's go, back into the world and lead. After World War I, it was 20 years. And even Hitler rampaging across Europe was not enough to convince Americans that they ought to engage. I don't know which trough we're in, whether we're in a brief, shallow trough or a deep and long trough. My gut tells me it's the latter.
So, speaking of troughs, Derek.
So, first, apologies about the foot. Don't know, this is not the most pleasant thing to look at for everybody. But I agree with a lot of what Bob said about kind of the overall trend, and as we've seen through history, the back and forth. I actually, when I look at this data, I see us as coming out of a trough in some ways. If you look at I looked at some of the trend analysis, you didn't present it here, but the question of should the U.S. be globally engaged was down in the single digits in 2011, 2012, is now climbing up out of that. And look, I think there's no question, if you look at what President Obama inherited in 2008, this wasn't just kind of he as a leader decided it's time for us to do nation building at home, so therefore that as a kind of ideological matter, that's what we should be doing. That was what he confronted. I mean, it was the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. We were shedding 800,000 jobs a month. There were entire sections of our economy that were in jeopardy. And part of the reason for that, not the only reason, maybe not even the most important reason, part of the reason for that was the way we had conducted ourselves in the world in the 2000s, mainly by going to war without paying for it anyway, doing it on a credit card without a limit. So we needed to right-size that. We needed to steady the ship. And I think that's what he did. What's interesting, Bob, is you're right, because if 8 years ago, if we were sitting here, it would have been all about the post-American world, the rise of the BRICS. Actually, that's not what we're seeing now. Goldman Sachs closed up its BRICS fund last year because it's not making any money. I think there's some renewed confidence of America in the world. What I'm struck by, this is where I totally agree with Bob, is there's a lot more partisanship about American foreign policy generally. It won't come as much of a surprise to you all, given that I served in the Obama administration, that although both parties are complicit in that, and Lord knows on the Democratic side in the 2000s, there were no badges of honor earned in the way the Democrats handled the critique of the Iraq War oftentimes. But I think there's no question that the Republican Party has become more partisan and more corrosive over the last 8 years for a lot of reasons that have nothing to do with foreign policy, and it's affected all parts of our political debate, particularly our foreign policy debate. So therefore, it's made it harder for President Obama, who has tried to pursue what I believe is a sound strategy for the future. It's been harder to implement that. Given the fact that he has a political environment here at home that is extremely difficult to manage. It's not going to get any easier for Secretary Clinton, unfortunately, although I think Bob's absolutely right. She is the best prepared in terms of her experience and the policies she supports to navigate this, but it's not going to get any easier for her.
Derek, can I challenge you on, in terms of renewed confidence of the U.S., is it that or is it lack of confidence in the rest of the world right now, given the instability that you see, certainly still in the Middle East, the rise of Russia in terms of new efforts in Russia to expand into Eastern Europe with China and the questions of what's happening in South China. I mean, there's a lot of instability that Obama will hand off to Clinton or Trump.
And the question is not, is there instability? Because there's always instability. I mean, we could pick out, look at 1968 and what Richard Nixon inherited from Lyndon Johnson.
These
that was
numbers
pretty
to
tough.
you say renewed confidence.
It seems to me we're on an uptick. I mean, Bob's right. This goes back and forth. And if you look at the overall trend, it's always kind of lukewarm support for U.S. engagement globally anyway. I mean, for a foreign policy person, it's always a little humbling to look at these numbers because what we consider as an uptick is going from 7% to 19%, which at the high point over the last 20 years might have been 21%, right? It's not as though we were at the glory days of 90 in the 90s and we've fallen back. But it seems to me we are trending upward, but it's very hard to make that case given what's going on in the world, given the political environment that we're in, given that we have a candidate now who is in charge of one of our political parties, whose campaign is based on fear and anxiety and demonizing the other. I mean, that's going to be a very hard case to make. And if I could just say on Europe, I mean, I know Pew in the next few weeks will be having your polls from Europe coming out. Mm-hmm. No question Obama has not met expectations in Europe, but of course those expectations were ridiculous, right? I mean, this was the idea that he was going to come in and magically wave the wand and all problems would instantly disappear, which of course, Bob knows better than anybody else and has written more eloquently than anybody else about the kind of the structural differences in worldviews that many United States and Europe have. And I think the fact that the world is hard and he's worked very hard to improve U.S.-European relations, he hasn't met the overly inflated expectations Europeans had on him. That said, my guess is, I'll be interested in seeing the polling data when it's out in a few weeks, if you compare to where we are with Europe today, 2016, to where we were 8 years ago in 2008, you're still going to see a very significant difference for the better.
If I may say something, I want to say very clearly that I find absolutely normal that the Americans have been reevaluating their foreign policy and the way they were intervening in the world. I think it's common sense and a kind of instinct of a good instinct that they have questioned, the post-Iraq scenario. Let's be clear. I mean, Obama was right when he said that Iraq was a disaster. It has been a disaster, and I think it's good that the Americans are totally aware of that. At the same time, I've been traveling a lot throughout the U.S., for the campaign, talking to Trump supporters, but also Hillary supporters and senators, and I don't have the feeling that the Americans are very confident about what the American U.S. foreign policy is doing in the world. I think they have a huge worry about the world. They have this very right instinct that they're not controlling anything, that nothing is controllable. And I think the emergence of someone like Trump, or in France, someone like Marine Le Pen, or the other populist leaders which are emerging throughout Europe at the moment, are a sort of testimony to the fact that the people are searching in a sort of nervous and nearly desperate way for some kind of shoulders or force that would protect them from the world, because they see a Middle East where everyone is fighting against everyone. They see a Europe which is becoming maybe mortal, as Le Monde has put at the front cover a few days ago. And so they see a world which has an impact. San Bernardino, November, the Bataclan in Paris, Belgium recently. I mean, extremely real geopolitical threats that they're not able to handle. Mm-hmm. And concerning Europe, I think that you cannot actually compare what happened, when Obama arrived and what is happening now, because you have actually the sort of superposition. You have two things happening. You have a total flux and change of the political scene of all countries. We're actually like in the 30s now. There is everything is changing. All the assumptions that we had about the elite, about what's going to happen, in terms of elections, are destroyed. I mean, we're seeing it with Trump, and the Europeans think that if Trump gets elected president, it's the canary in the mine, and we have to expect, similar processes could happen in Europe in 2017 in France. So the situation is extremely tense. The people are super nervous, and they don't take anything for granted. And what I wanted to say is that what Bob Kagan, very famously compared the structural differences that had existed between the Europeans and the Americans in terms of foreign policy. I think this is changing, and these assumptions should not be taken for granted. I think there could be some kind of reversal, paradoxical reversal, with Mars being now in Europe and Venus becoming the US. Why? Because we are in an existential crisis in Europe, And I think one of the big grudge that the Europeans have maybe towards this administration is that they haven't been sufficiently aware that this Syria crisis and this migration crisis is existential for us. What is happening is changing, the whole game. It's the game political, and it's the geopolitical game, because the European populations are ready to change alliance. And in this starting, you have huge segments of the population in France, in Germany, in the Netherlands, in, I would say, northern countries, which are starting to think, okay, should we really stick with the Americans? The Americans seem to be, withdrawing. We are faced with this huge political threat of radical Islam. President Obama doesn't even want to name this threat. And that has been, an incredible surprise for the Europeans, who just don't understand that he wouldn't name the threat.
Well, Carol,
and then you have the Russian.
Pick up on something you're here. Can I just have Carol jump in here, since you were looking at polling data in Europe, and you've gone through this process here. How do you account? I mean, you have some binary choices here, Republican or Democrat, in terms of you split down opinion. And it seems like we've got other layers to that now, right? You did separate out Trump. You talked about some of the nuances within even people who self-identify as Democrats.
Right.
How do you account for this and the rise of some nationalism within Europe as well? I mean, can you keep two columns anymore when you do these kind of surveys?
Well, I mean, part of this is it's conducted during an active presidential campaign, so you're naturally going to see some differences among the parties. I think Trump has added a new layer to that with his rhetoric. I think he's touched on the two themes that do resonate with Republicans these days, which is keep us safe and also pull back. I mean, those aren't entirely inconsistent, and I think he's hit on both themes, and as you can see from the data, both resonate with a large number of Republicans. I think on the Democratic side, you see a little bit more of a traditional kind of liberal, moderate split on some of these issues like civil liberties or how deeply to get involved. It feels like the Democrats may come together on some of these issues in a general election campaign. It's hard to know about Republicans because these divisions on, say, economic engagement are pretty serious. I mean, this is a pretty significant difference within the Republican Party on things like trade and economic engagement.
Well, when you describe Trump as keep us safe but pull us back, you have 68% of Republicans favoring sending ground troops to fight ISIS in Iraq and Syria, pretty substantial percentage. 70% of Republicans say military force is the best approach to defeating global terrorism. I mean, you are seeing still a hawkish view in terms of engagement on those levels.
Keep us safe on that side. Those are the reflections of keep us safe. This is very interesting. Pull back on the economic side. And
There's actually a way to understand that, but we're just not used to this kind of America, if I may say so. I mean, there's an engagement that says, as we created after World War II, we have this alliance structure. Security comes from the fact that we have maintained stability with allies in East Asia, maintained stability with allies in Europe. There's another approach that America could take, which is a nationalist, power-oriented approach, which says we don't care about what's happening in Europe, we don't care what's happening in Asia. If we feel that there's a threat out there, we will go and blast it to smithereens.
The Jacksonian thing.
Well, I don't.
Yeah, I know.
Poor
Sorry.
Jackson never fought a war as president, but nevertheless, no. This is a model. That's why I would slightly disagree with Laura. Is that it's not that the United States is going to stop being inclined to use force. It's that it's going to use force for very narrow, selfish reasons when it feels like doing so, as opposed to, and I would say, I hate to say this, even Bush was not unilateralist in this sense. He still believed in allies. We can have an America that doesn't believe in allies, that is essentially a kind of rogue state that uses force when it feels like it wants to use force. And that is what I think Trump stands for. Yeah, we'll blast the hell out of them, but not because it has anything to do with anything else except our security.
Self-protection. And I think the thing about ground forces is some of this, as you say, hawkishness, I think comes as a critique of Obama that he hasn't done enough. There's oppositionalism or whatever among Republicans that he hasn't done enough to deal with the threat of ISIS. And I think that's shared by many, many Republicans. If the question becomes a real question, large numbers of ground troops against ISIS, it's hard to know where Republicans will come down. I don't know the answer to that based on this data. I mean, an actual full engagement against ISIS. I think a lot of what you're seeing is a critique of Obama's handling of ISIS on the Republican
And
side.
if I could just say, it's fundamentally political. I mean, there's a great Bill Clinton line, strong and wrong always beats weak and right. And when the world is complicated and you see there's a lot to be fearful of, of course, it's natural to say, well, what we should do about it is go schwack them. You know, that it's satisfying, it's measurable. It's something that it feels decisive, it feels strong. And what President Obama has been trying to do, and it's still very much a work in progress, is redefine what it means to be strong. And I think in this Trump represents almost like a pure form of what Obama is against, right? In some ways, Trump is a lot like Vladimir Putin in terms of how he defines strength, how he defines strength on the global stage, how he defines strength in his personal life.
That's why Putin likes him so much.
Bingo, exactly. You know, this you don't differentiate between the self
Russia
and the
is
state.
rooting for Trump. I just want you to know, seriously, it's very clear.
And Obama has a very different view of strength. It doesn't mean that military power isn't important. In fact, it's very important for President Obama, but it's not the sole measurement of how you define strength. Politically, that's hard to translate, no doubt about it.
I remember you said to me once, you never get credit for coalition building.
Right.
And that seems to be something that the administration's leaned very heavily on or tried to emphasize, coalition building. But that's something that seems, Americans don't swallow that as a leadership to
Right.
be,
And some of it goes to this
if
allies.
no one's in charge, then no one's actually
Right,
leading
and
us anywhere.
allies are free riders, right? They should be paying for more of things. Although that's belied by the amazingly high number on NATO, which I was surprised by. I mean, as someone who thinks a lot about Europe and transatlantic security, that was a real piece of good news. But if you think about, say, then the climate change numbers, I mean, if you just play this out, if a Republican gets elected in November, and this is not just Donald Trump or Ted Cruz, it would have been the same if Marco Rubio had been elected. They would have denied climate change as a problem. They would have not wanted to close Gitmo. They would have wanted to keep it open and add detainees to it. We would have brought back torture.
Because it's so closed now.
We would have brought back torture.
After 8 years of Obama.
We would have, the first act in office is to unwind the Iran deal. Well, that's not going to boost your numbers in Europe much. So whatever one thinks of Obama right now, there's no question what the Europeans would want a year from now. And it's also not a way you're going to build an alliance or get coalition partners to do more of the work.
Can you explain the ideological difference you're also seeing among Democrats? I mean, you pointed out some change, particularly measurable with Israel and
Right. Why? Some of that is again possibly something of a campaign effect. I mean, Sanders has been talking differently about Israel.
Is it that? Is it the Iran?
Yeah.
Is it the J Street versus
Well,
AIPAC?
I think there are a lot of
constituency?
factors. I mean, our data, when Netanyahu came to the United States, liberals in particular had a very negative reaction to Netanyahu. That's clear, and I think some of it is the rhetoric you're hearing in the 2016 campaign from Bernie Sanders.
Mm-hmm. The BB Bernie effect is changing
The BB Bernie effect.
Democratic self-identification on this. It's interesting. But Laura, I want to get back to an idea you were tapping into, which is that it's not about geostrategic positioning. A lot of this is about fear among the populace and underestimating that. 80% of Americans say ISIS is a major threat to the U.S. I think there are people, certainly within the security establishment, who would say that's overinflated versus threats from elsewhere in the world from perhaps more traditional players. But that is absolutely reshaping the political dynamic here and in Europe, particularly with the refugee crisis there. And there are people within the counterterrorism community who would say the refugee problem, if not now, will become a security threat. But you're saying right now in Europe, that's being viscerally felt right now.
Absolutely.
Do you think that's the way you see the U.S. going, essentially? I mean, is that something that's just of the moment in Europe and that will pass as these integration programs get built up?
I think the situation is going to get worse in Europe. I mean, I'm very pessimistic because, I mean, the people who work on migrations in Europe. I mean, there's a woman who used to be one of the big shots of the World Bank here. She had a big position. Went back to Europeans working on the migrations from Africa, and the numbers she's announcing of migrants coming from Africa because of wars, drought, water issues, radical Islam, are absolutely staggering. What is going to happen? You know, the problem of Europe is that we are geographically, placed at the center, at the crossroad of the conflicts and of the migrations. So our situation, we are in an extremely vulnerable situation, and of course the Americans are much further. I mean, they're across the pond. They are in a way protected from this absolutely incredible seismic chain earthquake that we are actually seeing coming. So I understand that in the US you cannot have the same perception, and also the question of Islam in the US, it cannot be perceived in the same way because you don't have the same percentage of the population, Muslim population. I'm not.
That's what's so odd about how successful Trump has been and this is an instance of, I really believe, a political figure creating an issue before the issue actually exists. I mean, Europeans are being flooded with hundreds and thousands, if not millions, of refugees.
Exactly.
The United States, this became a scandal in the United States when the Obama administration agreed to take how many?
Like
10,000?
10,000, and how many have actually come?
Hundreds?
About 2,000.
In the hundreds. Moreover, as the Washington Post recently did a kind of, to try to discover the known terrorists or the known people accused of terrorism, who are they? They are not refugees. Most of them are citizens, naturalized citizens, who've been here for years and who were radicalized in the United States, not sent from others.
Is
So
that because it became conflated with immigration, period?
I think that as someone has said, Trump is doing what demagogues do, which is not only playing on existing fears, but actually creating fears. And it's
one
easy
thing,
to say.
The media environment had something to do with this, and so
Media people are constantly blaming yourself for everything that's going on. I think it's very charming.
One statistic in August of 2014, we didn't ask the question I wish we had. The Wall Street Journal, NBC, asked, were you aware of the ISIS beheading videos? 98%. You don't see that figure in a public opinion poll. I mean, ISIS emerged on the scene in a way that just
Right,
dominated.
but it required somebody to say, and by the way, because the American Muslim population, as Laura has indicated, is an entirely different position than the European
Yes,
Muslim
Bob,
population.
But not because it's because the Americans are better at
I'm not saying it is.
integrating
No, it's because
that's
who
what
can
I've been
afford to get all the way to the United
But
States? It's a
it's not
self-selecting
true.
group. No,
Exactly.
I know. God forbid it should be anything the United
Because
States did that was
apparently
good.
it's the common view in this town.
No, I
But,
know.
I
And
agree
now
with
you've
it all.
successfully rebutted it, Laura. So, but whatever the reason is, it's a totally different situation in terms of the Muslims in America. But Donald Trump has actually gotten tremendous support from people that I know that I'm very surprised to hear them say these things. But yeah, we really do need to keep all the Muslims out until we find out what's going on with them. And I mean, to me, this is just, again, it's classic demagoguery creating really something bordering on hysteria, which has nevertheless been extremely successful.
But according to this poll, 3/4 of Republicans view it as a major threat to the U.S.
Well,
That's
sure.
not just the Trumpian.
Right, no,
polling data.
Well, but I mean, it's not. First of all, I didn't see any Republicans dissenting from this view because they're afraid. The rest of the Republican Party has been running scared from the Trump voter throughout this entire period. So who's going to dissent from any of that? I mean,
But there is also the threat itself. I mean, you cannot deny that the threat exists. I'm sorry. I mean, San Bernardino was not invented by Trump.
no, but it was not a product of refugees.
Yeah, it was not a refugee.
Or even, I mean, what law would you have had to set up to keep those people out of the country?
No, I'm not talking about the migrant crisis, but the terrorism crisis and the question of radical Islam is a question that is bothering the Americans because it's a real question. And because radical Islam is waging a war against a part of the Muslim world that doesn't agree with it, and also with the West. And that's why, the people in the US are worried, and I think they should be, personally.
Well, one thing that surprised me, because yes, it's really obvious where the fear is, and that's ISIS. Refugees come up as well. But on Russia and China, no sign of growing public concern here. The 23%, it's not negligible, but it's certainly not as high as one would think, given the amount of, if you want to blame the media coverage of Vladimir Putin and what you have seen, not just in Syria, but in Ukraine. I mean, why isn't that higher on the list of threats?
Because the threat that Putin poses is to his neighbors, not to the United States. And that's why I'm saying we're moving into this very, it's about us mood. And so Islamic terrorism can strike in the United States, as it has, obviously. And by the way, much more dramatically than San Bernardino, there was the, 9/11.
But yet China didn't.
Right, but I mean, those are long-term, again, China.
But cyber terrorism was up there as one of the top concerns.
But
Well, I don't know what Americans think
I don't know
where
they think that comes from. I mean, China, it
Cyber
seems to me that's explained by just their own economic crisis. And again, where we were 8 years ago was a China that was universally seen as ascendant. I'm surprised, though, that those numbers weren't higher, just because of the coverage both countries, particularly Putin's, gotten here. But it's been kind of consistent, is my recollection. I mean, there's not an appreciable dip, but they've always been about the 25% or so is seen as a threat.
Yeah, it's that those numbers have been, both the threat numbers and this other separate question we ask about China as a, quote, adversary, have been remarkably stable over time.
You have to go to a lacrosse game. You're on hook, Trey.
Okay, now you've spilled the beans. Yes, my son has a lacrosse.
Good luck to him, and thank you. Yeah, can you? Thank you, Bob. But one of the things.
So now the cake is on. You talk about him?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, exactly. And what really happened here.
Exactly, yeah, right.
The polling data also doesn't show a lot of confidence in what's actually being done to fight ISIS. And in terms of the war without combat that we are engaged in right now, Derek. Why is there not more confidence?
It's a good question. I mean, I think part of the problem is, in terms of just from a messaging point of view, that there's two things going on. First, the incremental way the campaign against ISIS has unfolded has meant, for most of us, even those of us who watch it pretty closely, means that kind of these incremental changes, while significant, they kind of wash over us in some ways. I mean, if you had said, added up everything the United States is currently doing against ISIS, saying, if you had said to me in September 2014, by May of 2016, we conducted nearly 12,000 airstrikes. We'd have 5,000 guys on the ground in Iraq. We'd have special operators in Syria. We would have killed, estimated 25,000 ISIL fighters in Iraq and Syria through our air campaign. That's a pretty significant body of work there. But the way it's been sort of incrementally staged means we don't see it, and it just kind of washes over us. The fact that every day American pilots get in a plane and go bomb something in Iraq and Syria.
Do you think that's a political choice?
No, I think it's just the way the campaign has unfolded. I mean, the military campaign has unfolded.
Really? I mean, even with the death of this Navy SEAL this week brought this question to the fore once again, in terms of there not being a fair understanding of the level of engagement that the U.S. has. Sure. Particularly those who are in combat situations.
They are in harm's way, but they're not on combat missions, which is...
But they are in combat.
They are in extremely dangerous situations, training, advising, and assisting forces that are in direct combat. But they're not... it's not Iraq during the surge, where every day they're running combat missions, right? Are they in situations when a city, as happened the other day, when a city gets overrun by ISIS fighters and our guys are there, they're going to defend themselves and they're going to have direct contact with the enemy?
But arguably, one of the problems on messaging has been explaining things in the past tense of what it's not rather than what it is the argument. And not a fair understanding of the level of engagement. I mean, 58% of people polled said the campaign's not going too well.
But
They
isn't it
don't know that there are folks on the battlefield involved in firing artillery that are engaged.
But-
But
Is it
why
because-
not explain that and message that in more detail? Would it not help?
So again, I look at this, I think the administration's trying. I mean, as you know, in the last 6 months, they have done these, they do these NSC meetings at various other agencies, which is the first time I've ever seen them do that, where they go to the State Department or the Pentagon or CIA to do an NSC photo spray. But this, because it's of course often hard to show, meetings don't present well in terms of you actually doing something, but it's pretty important to do that, right? I think that I see the administration trying to talk about this a lot, being very specific on the number of airstrikes they've conducted, being very open with the press. The press has been reporting on this a lot, I think. Why it's not breaking through, I don't know.
Well, the airstrikes are different than the question of boots on the ground, which is, I think, what you were comparing it to.
But it's not a secret that we've got up to 5,000 boots on the ground in Iraq. But these are folks who are, since they're not on combat missions, these are people who are doing the hard work behind the scenes, so to speak. Thankfully, there's not a lot of folks coming home and going to Walter Reed. It's harder for people to see that, and I get that. So it is a messaging challenge for this administration. The other challenge the president has, which he's admitted to, is because he does not believe that ISIS presents an existential threat to the United States. It is a threat, no question about it. But is the future of the United States hanging in jeopardy because of the ISIL threat? No. And he's tried at times to put this threat in context to everything else that is going on to the world and the huge economic challenges we face, the rise of new powers, alliances that are in question, global climate change, which is over the long term a huge threat to the United States. That sometimes, as the president has admitted, that has not risen to the moment of the emotion that people feel, and the fear that they feel, fear that is being pumped and by political adversaries who want to use the fear for their own advantage. So after San Bernardino or after the Paris attacks, there was a sense the president didn't emote enough about this, right? And he admitted, in some cases, he should have done more to sort of reach people where and address their fears. But I think if we try to think of this as a long-term effort, an effort where the United States is going to be militarily engaged in the Middle East for quite a long time, and I believe doing the kinds of things we've been doing in terms of direct U.S. action, U.S. support on the ground for our partners in the region, we're going to be doing this for a while. We need to make it sustainable. This is not something where we're going to invade Iraq and Syria and solve this problem and it's all going to be done. And that's the challenge for all of us. It's going to be a huge challenge for Europe too, because we've all got to saddle up and be ready to keep doing this for quite some time. And so the president, I think, is trying to set expectations in a way that allows us to be able to sustain the support to do that.
I want to also get to audience
can I
questions.
just say one thing?
Can I just get people ready for that? If you have a question, is it a microphone that's going around? Okay, and it'll come to you. Sorry, Laura, do you want to?
Yes, I'm just wondering whether the fact that the message hasn't been received as the administration would have liked is not due to the fact that people don't understand the strategy. I mean, they don't see the end game. They see these bombings, this sort of very gradual, incremental approach, but there is no, on the military side of this operation, doesn't make sense in a way. I mean,
What doesn't make sense about it?
I mean, it doesn't make sense. You have two strategies at work. You have the Russian one, where you have a very clear, very cynical, I would say, pretty horrible approach, which is to support the regime which has actually unfolded and contributed to the mess. But they are relying on a government and on a state to pursue their objectives, which is to regain control of Syria. And on the other side, you have the Obama administration and the coalition around, which are trying to support, nobody knows exactly who, to fight against ISIS, and at the same time, keep some space open for the future political future of Syria. And I think the people, this situation, I mean, it's just an extremely very difficult, I would say even terrible situation to defend. And we know that the administration has been trying to negotiate a political settlement with the Russians at the same time. But I think the skepticism and the pessimism of the public opinion and of the people in Europe and in the US is that we're seeing the Russians, playing the US on this battlefield, doing exactly things as they want, and actually using this Syria question to regain some ground, but major, I would say, focus to win in Europe. And that's one thing we haven't discussed, which is absolutely central, is that in the perception of the U.S. foreign policy, of the world, and of the foreign policy of the U.S. in Europe, is the fact that people are disappointed, disillusioned in a way. They are worried. They would like the U.S. to be there, some of them, or they are anti-American. There is a growing wave. You probably will see that in your future polling against the Americans. And you have this pro-Russian wave growing, and it's very worrying. I mean, for someone like me who knows what Russia is about at this moment, but they are gaining ground in a spectacular way. There is a battle. The battlefield is not only military, it's of course informational, propaganda. It's kind of a, post-truth space in Russia, right? You can say things which are not true, but if you say them with aplomb, it works, right? Yes, it sounds familiar.
Can you raise your hand if you have a question here? Okay, can we bring the mic here, this gentleman on the aisle, and then here in the middle?
Thank you very much. John Gizzi, Chief Political Correspondent and White House Correspondent for Newsmax. So much has been said about Donald Trump today. Yesterday, Steve Hilton, the former campaign manager for David Cameron, criticized his close friend and one-time boss, Mr. Cameron, for saying that Trump's remarks on foreign policy were divisive and stupid, quote unquote. And those remarks, of course, came on the heels of Foreign Minister Steinmeier's criticism of Mr. Trump's foreign policy approach. Mr. Hilton said that it's a mistake for world leaders to criticize Donald Trump in those terms because they may well be working with him in terms of international policy. So no matter how outrageous they may think his remarks are, they shouldn't criticize in that way. What is the attitude of the panel? Does it help or hurt if foreign leaders criticize the presumptive Republican nominee for president on his statement on the international front?
I mean, look, as you know, American presidents try to stay out of other countries' politics as much as possible, unless invited, as President Obama was. Yes, as David Cameron invited President Obama a few weeks ago, which actually belies the point that Obama is sort of in the basement in terms of Europe. I think in many ways he's more influential and respected today in Europe than any European leader is in their own country, certainly in France.
Well, in France, the level is very low.
But I'd say the same right now for the UK or Germany. I believe it's hard to think of any country where the leader's particularly popular right now, and Obama's probably the most popular leader in Europe. And that said, I don't know the context in which the Prime Minister made these remarks, whether he was asked a question. I mean, clearly, when one of the candidates is talking about an alliance like NATO and saying, we will get out of NATO, or our allies are ripping us off and don't do anything for us, I mean, it seems to be perfectly justifiable for that leader to say, well, I disagree with that. I don't think that's in our country's interest if the United States, which is our most important partner, were to have a policy that would actually pursue that. That seems to be very reasonable and perhaps unreasonable for us to expect that leader would say, I have no comment on this. But again, I don't know the specifics of those instances you mentioned.
Merkel basically said no comment when she was asked in Germany last week. And it was actually interesting to watch President Obama's laugh when she said
Well, I
no
mean,
comment.
again, like, you know, she doesn't.
Did either of you want to weigh
I
in?
think a lot of Republicans right now are saying.
Yeah,
no
exactly. I
comment.
mean, you got 150 Republican colleagues of mine who've all said they're never going to work for the guy. So it's.
I was talking to a friend of Donald Trump yesterday night about, you know, Donald Trump's approach to politics and, you know, to life. And he said, well, Donald Trump's actually, he's capable, he's been saying these horrible things about, you know, his adversaries, about Ted Cruz, about Marco Rubio, but he's a sportsman, so that means when he's on the ring, and when he gets out of the ring, it's going to be okay. So maybe these foreign leaders can say exactly the same thing. While he's not president, they can say whatever they think, because if they think some of his propositions are outrageous, maybe they can say what they think. And when he's out of the ring, and if he's president, they're going to say, okay, now we are going to talk. But more generally about Trump, I think that, you know, some of the discourse of Trump on foreign policy doesn't strike me as being so different. I mean, when Trump talks about, you know, using strength and restraint, it reminds me of Reagan. But of course, some other points of Trump's, you know, propositions are more worrying, like, you know, his
Giving
lack
nuclear
of
weapons to
Yeah.
Asian countries?
I mean, I think
exactly,
it's-
or the NATO, indeed, you know, this apparent lack of awareness that NATO is absolutely crucial for the U.S. and even for the U.S. power. You know, even if you argue as a nationalist, I mean, the importance of the
force
West
multiplier,
and having NATO is absolutely huge. But at the same time, I wonder, and you would know probably better than I do, and that's what I'm trying to figure out, is because of I'm sort of trustful of the American political system and its resiliency, I'm asking the question, if he gets to the White House, who is going to shape his brain on foreign policy? Probably not only his instincts as we see them now, and you're going to have the whole Washington, you know, community working to change his views. Isn't it what's going to happen?
We'll see. Here, I said here, this gentleman in the middle, and then we'll come to the other side of the room.
Hi, my name is Dimitri. I don't have an affiliation. Thank you. Very interesting discussion. My first question is mostly for Mr. Doherty. I was wondering if you, during this survey or any others, have measured the degree to which people feel like they're well informed about what's going on in the world. Is there any type of question like that? And do you feel like the issues have become more complicated in the last 20, 30 years? Because it might be trite to say, but people probably feel like the fear and anxiety that Trump uses comes from ignorance. And the other question I had was, it shows that the United Nations support has gone up 10% over the last decade. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts or comments on that.
Yeah, that was a little bit surprising given the, you know, what's been happening. On the, you know, we do knowledge surveys of what people know about international affairs, and it's mixed. I mean, you know, that it's, you know, Americans probably, you know, aren't as well informed as Europeans, either because of their geography or history or whatever. It's not a high priority for some people. I do think things have, the issues themselves have become more complex, as you say, you know, especially within the Middle East. You know, I mean, we've had findings. I remember when the Syrian crisis, this was 4 or 5 years ago, first erupted, you know, and the American public, large majority saying, there just aren't any good options over there. I mean, this was, you know, a sense of
I think
almost.
that's still a talking point.
You know, exactly.
If anyone's got good options, show me.
Almost a sense of futility and confusion. Which side should we support? You know, can you support any side in some of these conflicts? So it is confusing for a lot of Americans. I think that's right.
Over here on this side of the room, and then we'll go to the back.
Dick Solomon, Rand. My question in some ways is directed at Pew, Mr. Doherty, but to what degree, well, Bob Kagan talked about the sine wave quality of America's approach to the world, et cetera. How vulnerable is this country to some external shock, strategic surprise, however you want to characterize it as catalyzing a certain direction or a certain approach to the world. It seems to me that since we are in a period of turmoil and unexpected changes abroad, that the patterns that were described in terms of foreign policy held in this country are pretty vulnerable to some external shock. 9/11 obviously was a major one. The economic crisis, ISIS. It seems to me there's potentially a lot of instability in our approach to the world. And as the comments earlier made about Obama trying to create a broader context for what are the real threats and relative priorities, that the danger we face, and you could say that the reaction to 9/11 was a good case of that, that we're hit with a shock and we react in the wrong way, in what turns out to be a much more costly way.
Well, I think you see a little bit of that in the reactions to the San Bernardino and Paris attacks. I mean, you know, in one of the questions that pollsters track is the most important problem facing the United States. The classic question goes back decades. And, you know, for a long time, even with the rise of ISIS, it's a volunteered response. So people didn't really volunteer terrorism much, even with the rise of ISIS, you know, prior to those. It became number one, the top problem almost overnight after these two attacks in December. And you know, it subsequently eased off, but I think you see from that this is something that's there right under the surface, and these concerns over terrorism are ready to really surge.
Can we go to the back here?
Thank you very much. Dong Huiyu with China Review News Agency of Hong Kong. My question is for Derek. I'm wondering the possible presidency of Donald Trump, how the presidency of Donald Trump would affect the U.S. policy toward China and the U.S. competitive position with China in the world. Thank you. What's your take?
Well, obviously, I do not speak for Donald Trump, so I have really no clue. I mean, I wonder if he even has a clue about how he would handle China. So I don't know. I mean, I don't even want to go there.
There was, I think in the poll, I have it written down here, 50% of Americans view its rise as a major power, as a major threat. But if I remember correctly, I think that was in the economic context.
Right.
Not necessarily
General context, China's emergence as a global power.
I mean, look, my argument would be China, there's no country I can think of that benefited more from the policy decisions that we made in the 2000s than China. In 2008, where you had the United States bogged down in Iraq, fighting global war on terror that wasn't going well, and in a complete tailspin economically, that was China's moment. In fact, my sense is, Jeff Dyer was here, so he wrote a book about this, where that was the moment that many in the Chinese government decided this is when we make our move, because the US is going down. President Obama saw that, so he wanted to try to arrest that decline, put us on a more stable footing, not just with China, but vis-a-vis the rest of the world, get us out of sort of a perpetual war footing, where war was the single prism with which we looked at U.S. power in the world, and obviously renew our economy at home. I think although we have huge economic problems still, we're a lot better off today than we were 8 years ago, right? The U.S. auto industry just had the best year on record last year. It was on the brink of non-existence in 2009.
But what's
right?
the trajectory with China? Because you have all these incidents that are bubbling up in South China Sea and the like.
Sure, I mean, so China's rise, even though China's rise has plateaued a bit recently because of their own economic challenges, demographic challenges, certainly their environmental challenges. It is unquestionable that China is continuing to rise, and the U.S. needs to adapt to that rise, push back when necessary, and seek to work with China where we can. I don't see how anything that Donald Trump has talked about puts us in a better position to do any of that. I think we are better off today under the leadership of President Obama vis-a-vis China than we were 8 years ago, and I think the same would be true under Secretary Clinton.
But you don't see us headed towards conflict?
Well, no. I mean, the South China Sea gets pretty sporty, as you know.
Yeah.
A lot of this is going to depend on decisions that are going to be made in Beijing, and clearly the relationship. There's David Senny's here in the front row, knows a lot more about this than I do, but I think the relationship is one that will be fraught in the future. We're going to bump up against one another. There's no doubt about it. The question to me is, how can we be in the best position, militarily, politically, economically, to prevail in the event that happens? I feel pretty good about our position today. If we were to make other policy choices, I would feel less good about our position.
I think we have time for about maybe 1.5 questions, depending on how short we are here. Right there.
Thank you very much. George Chelishvili, visiting scholar from Georgia, Georgetown University. So my question, even though the issue was raised by Bob, who already left the room, I'm sure that all panelists are perfectly knowledgeable to elaborate on it, is about the periods, about the waves of engagement into world affairs and this current trough. And historically, the events which woken America up into international engagement were of the magnitude of Lusitania sinking in the World War I, or Pearl Harbor, or Sputnik, or missiles, Soviet missiles 100 miles from the shores. So some significant international events, developments, which shows that some power is very hostile and they might be after us, and therefore kind of the United States got engaged. I believe the 9/11 doesn't fit the bill because it was obviously not by the state, but by some crazy people, which not necessarily means that they are existential threat. Do you think, and therefore actually it didn't translate into US involvement? And for me personally, I speak as a scholar, as a citizen of small country, Georgia, in the Russian vicinity, this is very important whether the United States is engaged in the world or not. It might be existential for my country. So do you think that something of this event of this magnitude might happen so that United States is like woken up again? So approximately when will it happen and whether it will happen? Thank you.
So how hard does Russia have to poke before the U.S.
So
pokes
again,
back, I think is sort of the question.
I get frustrated by this mythology of U.S. disengagement. I'm just trying to figure out how one gets to that conclusion. I mean, I look at Asia, where we are far more engaged today, again, than we were 8 years ago. We've been famously rebalancing Asia, putting more military posture there, doing a lot more diplomatically, joining Asian institutions like the East Asia Summit. I look at Latin America. We are in a completely different place in Latin America than we were a decade ago with the opening to Cuba, where now whereas we were kind of an outlier country within the hemisphere 8 years ago, now we are a leader in the region. I look at sub-Saharan Africa. That's arguably an area of bipartisanship, where George W. Bush did a lot of good in sub-Saharan Africa. President Obama's continued that. Probably tens of thousands West Africans that are alive today, not dead from Ebola because of what the U.S. did several years ago. I look at Europe. I concede the point. Europe is in a whole mess of crises, not by the U.S. making. And I would argue, and I'm going to bet that the Pew polls in a few weeks are going to show that we're still in a pretty good position in Europe in terms of U.S.-European relations. Despite Obama not meeting the wildly high expectations that were forced upon him, he's still, as I said, the most popular leader in Europe today. So the part of the world where there's the most sort of uncertainty and fear and this argument of disengagement is the Middle East. So how do you measure engagement? Is engagement 150,000 troops in Iraq? Is engagement, rather than 11,000 airstrikes, it's 110,000 airstrikes? I mean, we've got more military posture today in the Middle East. In fact, this was actually the case before September 2014 and the ISIL fight started. We had more military posture then post-Iraq than we did before 9/11. So, where is it the U.S. is disengaging? I mean, what international meeting occurs that it's not the United States driving the agenda? So there's this kind of mythology that I think is a lot of it's politics, right? Because it's easy politics to say, Obama's weak, Obama's a failure, Obama's not tough enough, he's not strong. Yeah, I don't buy that. I mean, so where is this lack of engagement? So explain that to me.
Well, I think we have one more question here. Here. I think you also were sort of chomping at the bit. Was it a comment or a question?
He wanted
It's a-
Sedney?
No, it's a question. David Sedney with CSIS. Secretary of Defense Carter, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff have been very strongly saying recently that Russia is the #1 strategic threat to the United States. The poll here says that American people think that it's ISIS. Europe thinks that it's the refugees. Is that discontinuity something to be concerned about?
ISIS.
Yeah, I mean, David, as you know very well, actually, I think if the military had been asked that question 3 years ago, they probably would have said the same thing because they look at capabilities, and so Russia, because of its nuclear arsenal, because of its conventional capability that's been modernizing over the last decade.
Dunford said something recently.
Oh, no, he has.
Yeah,
I'm just saying they
yeah.
would have answered it the same way 3 years ago. I mean,
Okay.
I think there's having worked on Russia at the Pentagon, I can say that there's always been a sense, if you just look at the math, China's certainly up there, and maybe it's Russia and China competing for who's the baddest on the block in terms of the military. What we've seen happen in the last 2 years, of course, is the question of their will, so the matching of the capabilities and the will, and watching Putin's, what he's willing to do in his own neighborhood, but then also the reckless behavior of the Russian military vis-a-vis the U.S. military at sea and in the air. So there's no question when you just look at the numbers Russia presents. If Russia were to go all in and choose to invade a Baltic country or launch a nuclear strike against the United States, it's a pretty big threat.
Not just belly rolls over U.S. fighter jets.
Right, no, right. That's not just that. That it's. I mean, if you look at the numbers, they've got a significant military arsenal. So a military leader would say that. I personally don't believe, when I think of the threats to the United States, that is, Russia's not what keeps me up at night, a head-to-head confrontation with them. I worry about an accident. I worry about an unintended conflict. But there are other things that keep me up at night other than that.
Very quick thought from the two of you on why that divergence.
What keeps Americans up at night, I suspect, is probably more terrorism related. There's no love for Putin in our polling. I mean, it's certainly very unpopular in the United States, but the concern just isn't there after the experience of terrorism over the last 15 years.
And it's that threat of putting your kid on the school bus to school and not knowing what happens next versus a territorial invasion, right?
Yeah,
And
I
that's
think-
what polls.
I mean, I would say that the threats are different, but they are both real. And what is interesting in Europe is that they conflate in a way. I mean, that Russia is using the radical Islam to change the European game. And since the U.S. have been, underestimating this radical Islam issue for several years, the Russians have just, it was like a boulevard for them that they went through saying, okay, we are here, we see the threat of radical Islam, and we're with you. If you want to be with a Christian big country aware of your problems, come to us. And I think this has been a leitmotif of the Russians, is to weaken Europe and weaken NATO. If they can, they will destroy the, Article 5 assistance. Yes, exactly. And these two issues actually are now extremely strongly connected. And what is very interesting is they're not only they have become factors of internal politics. I mean, what is absolutely striking is that Russia is now a topic of internal political divide in France. Between the parties, and Islam is as well, because everyone has his own views how to deal with it. And in France, in Europe, the issue is of course terrorism, but it's also the question of Islam in our societies, because this is somehow linked. I know that it's not totally politically correct here to say that, but actually after a while, the question of how you are going to deal with Islam, what do you allow, how much do you give to religion in the political realm, in the social realm, in terms of it's becoming a real issue. Mm-hmm. So I think that's why it's become existential, because radical Islamists perfectly know that they're trying to to gain some, there is a battle of the heart and minds, in other terms, in the Muslim population of Europe. They want to divide West European societies between Muslims and the others, and they're trying to win them over and radicalize the Muslim population. So it's a huge game. It's a very, very, very difficult and tricky one.
Well, I think we have to leave it there. The Clash of Civilizations conversation, I'm sure if you have comments, you can have separately on the sidelines here. I want to thank everyone. Thank you very much.
Margaret.
Thank you.